Hello, my name is Alberto Marquez. In this video, I will summarize some of the most important concepts in the planning section of the Port Planning and Investment Toolkit as prepared by the American Association of Port Authorities along with the Maritime Administration Department of the U.S. Department of Transportation. This video is not a replacement for reading the document since the toolkit has more details and offers a significant number of examples that will be useful for a thorough understanding of the steps of investment in capital projects in the context of ports and maritime terminals. Port Planning and Investment Toolkit Planning Module. Planning port project should analyze demand and capacity, market forces, and institutional structures. Also, it should integrate business and environment strategies as well as stakeholder needs. Project success depends on having a well-defined plan that provides essential information for informed decision-making and successful financing. A comprehensive plan that communicates a port owner's vision and business objectives may be prepared prior to the creation of a project plan. The toolkit focuses on guiding users through a common set of project-specific planning concepts and methods in the development of a project plan to maintain a highest and best use strategy for port owners' resources with regard to market, community, environment, land use, economic, and financial consideration. It is important to understand a project's requirements before committing a significant number of resources. When identify the relevant project planning efforts and the level of detail required for each, consider whether the project plan will be needed to provide strategic clarity to increase industry or investor confidence, engage specific stakeholders including regulatory governance, neighbors, tenants, industry, and communities, determine institutional, social, environmental, and/or economic impacts and mitigation approaches, integrate with local, regional, national regulations and transportation plans and policies, identify issues outside of the port's purview, such as road and rail traffic access to the port, and provide quantities and schedules of implementing project attributes, including permitting, design, construction, or acquisition. The planning stages and tasks described in the following sections, once adapted to a specific potential project, can be used to develop a project plan that has a logical, consistent, and organized format, and which decision makers and investors can quickly comprehend and evaluate. Initiate. Good practice in this stage include having meetings to define roles and responsibilities, project team and stakeholder points of contact, project quality control and communication protocols, sources of information, project goals and objectives, work program, milestone, and schedule. Key project issues and sensitivities, including outreach and other permitting and environmental requirements, if applicable, project goals and objectives. An initial draft of the project goals and objectives should be generated during the kickoff meetings and be presented during the stakeholder engagement to incorporate constituents' interests and needs. The project goals and objectives should be aligned with the port's vision and mission and informed by stakeholder values in pursuit of consensus. The strategic initiatives designed to attain the objectives may also be part of the project. Every project member should have a clear understanding of what the port owner hopes to achieve throughout the project definition process. The project goals and objectives become the basis of the evaluation criteria in the feasibility effort. Data collection. Many port owners conduct ongoing data collection efforts to ensure that decision makers have sufficient information about port investment, performance, operations, and community priorities. For specific projects, data collection begins during the kickoff meetings and continues through the duration of the project definition process. As shown in Exhibit 1.3, data can be about the strategy, infrastructure, operational, market, and financial. Stakeholder engagement. Port owners must constantly adjust and rebalance their actions to serve the varying needs of the community and customers. Stakeholder outreach is imperative in developing a port's overall vision. Identifying the project stakeholders and understanding their concern is critical. The effort should focus on engaging relevant stakeholders with the appropriate level of knowledge and keeping them informed about the project. Outreach should include engaging regulators and environmental agencies. Environmental review can take a long time, and resolving environmental issues is frequently the bottleneck in developing and completing a project. Even in cases where there is no negative environmental impact, it is very useful to communicate the ways in which a future project will benefit stakeholders. The port owner should host public community meetings and/or conduct workshops and small-scale seminars to discuss the potential project direction and solicit feedback. The creation of a project advisory panel is recommended to involve key stakeholders in the project definition process. Members of an advisory panel should include individuals who can enhance the project plan through their expertise and knowledge, such as facility owners and operators, community leaders, and/or freight industry representatives. An advisory panel may have different roles depending on the project, which may include but not limited to helping to form project goals and objectives, identifying stakeholders, contributing insight on the regional landscape of port activity and freight movement with regard to the potential project, facilitating stakeholder connections and communications, securing community input and buy-in for the project, reviewing and evaluating the findings from interviews and analysis, providing validation and quality assurance on the draft and final documents and initiatives. The advisory panel should include a chair and vice chair to provide oversight and direction, as well as port staff to provide guidance. A project website is useful for team members and stakeholders to check on the progress of the project and provide input, and to provide background materials available for reference. If a stakeholder has a vested interest that may not align with the port's goals, identify conflict resolution strategies that will help establish common ground and maintain the port's positive relationship with its stakeholders. Quantify. Quantify the port's capabilities, demands, and needs that led to the identification of the potential project. Capabilities are derived from close examination of the physical and operational aspects of the port. These include navigation works, goods movement terminals, and external rail and road links. Port demands are derived from market, commercial, logistics, and regulatory drivers. Project needs are derived by quantifying the gap between capabilities and drivers. Existing conditions. It is important to start with an inventory of relevant assets, and a record of the port's operations may be required depending on the project. The effort may also involve investigating the port's historical performance and researching the land use, regulatory, labor, environmental, and cultural setting. Port flood hazard areas should be given consideration to ensure the project plans take into account resilience to extreme weather and sea level rise. The assessment should also determine how nearby road and rail infrastructure may impact the potential project. The assessment will serve as the basis for the development of an opportunities and constraint documents during the form stage. Assets. Document and visually observe the condition of the relevant site, facilities, equipment, and land site, and water access by conducting site visits to each of the port locations related to the potential project. Exhibit 1.6 lists example of inventory items. Operations. Develop a profile of the operation at current facilities and potential project locations based on site visits, interviews with operators, and data collected on operating patterns. Process map or system diagrams can be utilized to document the flow of current and expected operations, to assist in characterizing how a potential project may need to adapt to shifting operating patterns and evolving technologies. External influences. Planning effort includes a high-level review of land use, zoning, political, environmental, and regulatory programs, policies, and developments. Port owners should work with their local government bodies and other stakeholders to communicate the project goals. External regional goals include, but are not limited to, attracting new businesses, include middle-class jobs, and promote economic development. Volumes and trade flows. The project plan should reflect a thorough understanding of the port's role in its wider marketplace. Data collected during the data collection informs the planning process on port volumes, origins and destinations, commodity types, and transportation modes. A survey of relevant shippers, carriers, logistic providers, and terminal operators improve understanding of the port's current market, as well as any priorities, requirements, and concerns. This information will serve as a baseline from which market-driven forecast scenario can be developed. Capacity. It is essential to understand the capacities and capabilities of existing port and near-port transportation systems. Capacity is often defined as the maximum throughput that can be handled by a port or facility in a specific time period. Capacity reflects a complex interaction of physical, operational, and commercial drivers. As such, facilities with a similar physical system may have very different capacities, and a facility with a fixed physical system can experience changes in capacity over time. Ports may exceed estimated capacity during brief peak periods. However, operational costs may rise and service may degrade as they do so. Finally, port facilities that must share assets, especially berths and cranes, may not always have access to the assets they need. In practical terms, it is usually difficult to operate at maximum capacity for extended periods. For this reason, planners often design facilities to a sustainable capacity or practical capacity. The toolkit refers to capacity as maximum practical capacity, which is defined as that throughput which, if exceeded, would cause a disproportionate increase in unit operating cost or business delay within the context of a facility land use, layout, and uncontrollable commercial drivers. While there are numerous methods to estimate port capacity, the complex flow of cargo and/or passengers through a port will certainly require computerized analysis in the form of capacity models. Project drivers. Project drivers are forces external to a port that impact a potential project and that may be the impetus behind the project. When considering all the reasons a port undertakes a project plan, consider that projects may have drivers in the following four categories: regulatory environment, market dynamics, competitive position, market forecast. Regulatory environment. Government agencies have the authority to promulgate regulations and requirements that affect port operations and port development, predominantly in the following areas: land use, environmental, transportation, labor, community, security, and health and safety funding. Port owners should maintain good relationships with the agencies that have authority over different aspects of their operation. Market dynamics. An assessment of ongoing regional and global trends and the nature of their impact on the port will help quantify future demand and define other marketplace drivers that may influence a project plan. It is important to consider major market groups by origin and destination and identify likely drivers and competitive factors relative to the potential project. A market analysis comprises the following tasks, as applicable. Develop traffic flows that originate, terminate, pass through, or are in proximity to the market regions of the port. Determine potential changes in regional traffic flows due to the changes in international and domestic trade and logistics patterns. Identify possible geographic markets and commodities that would obtain value from the realization of the potential project. To identify the major freight flows relevant to the port, several sources of trade and transportation data are publicly available. The Federal Highway Administration Freight Analysis Framework database provides historic and forecast detail on freight trade flows between foreign trade regions, port regions, and inland origins destinations. The U.S. Census Bureau International Trade Data provides more detailed commodity and port-level information on imports and exports by foreign country. Other sources of data include statistics from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, including cross-border freight data, American Association of Port Authorities, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Surface Transportation Board, and port and state transportation websites. Competitive position. Port owners often advance projects to improve the port's competitive position. Port owners often need to act quickly and at least preposition themselves to act quickly or risk losing a major business opportunity. A competitive analysis may be performed to identify the relative positions and market share of the ports compared to other ports serving its existing potential markets. The analysis should determine markets for which the port has realistic and sustainable competitive advantages that would support the development of the potential project. The market factors and port competitive analysis becomes the foundation upon which future demand forecasts are developed and project alternatives are prepared and evaluated. Demand forecast. A demand analysis serves to establish expected levels of throughput for the project and allows for the estimation of anticipated revenues over the project's life. The use of scenarios based on alternative economic outlooks and alternative assumptions about fundamental driving factors can provide a sense of how much and why actuals may vary from forecasts. In general, forecasts should take into account regional and national economic growth, historical trends in cargo and passenger growth, events identified during research and interview programs as likely to influence future volumes, and possible changes in the relative composition of the port and its facilities. Forecasting of imports may be best done by relating volumes to a range of projected levels of underlying domestic demand, such as consumer spending, investment in buildings, and changes in inventory. Best practice being to test sensitivities on each of these inputs to develop a risk-adjusted forecast. For exports, more specific drivers of product volumes may be identified, such as expected production of agricultural, energy, or other bulk exports, the expected position of such exports in the world markets, and exchange rates and economic growth of importing countries. The market projections may be divided into the following categories as applicable: domestic container and trailer, international container, dry and liquid bulk, break bulk, neo bulk, and projected and specialized cargoes, daily passengers, and multi-day passengers. Testing of sensitivities will be required by financial investors and rating agencies in later stages of the project definition process. Therefore, the demand analysis should include a baseline forecast and a high volume and low volume scenarios. The upside forecasts are used to identify the worst case environmental impact, while the downside is used for credit rating and financing purposes. Project needs. Before project alternatives can be created, define the project needs in terms of potential project elements such as infrastructure, equipment, and operations. Gap analyses are used to identify the magnitude of the project drivers that exceed the current conditions. Gap analysis. Determine the project needs by performing a gap analysis that assesses the differences between the port's current capabilities and performance and its opportunities and objectives relative to the potential project. When determining project needs, take into account the variability of gaps between project drivers and existing capabilities along with the potential risk factors, which can impact the timing of development and the project's return on investment. For example, the purchase of additional cranes to handle the larger vessels projected to call at the port in the future may result in a lower return on investment if the carrier alerts its service route and eliminates the port call. Similarly, a port may lose revenue awaiting the completion of a terminal expansion if market demand outpaces the port's projections and the additional cargo is shifted to another regional port. Form. Prepare a range of project alternatives that can be undertaken to meet the project needs while minimizing the project impacts. Each alternative should provide sufficient detail to facilitate the measurement of impacts and performance. The ultimate goal of the form process is to identify a small number of highly refined and reasonable plan alternatives for further analysis and assessment on feasibility. Project context. An early step in the form stage is to understand the context in which the project alternatives need to be formulated. At any given time, a port owner will perceive a range of opportunities and constraints for project formation and execution. The project context generally takes the form of an opportunities and constraint document. The opportunities and constraint document summarizes the conditions that may provide physical opportunities and constraints within the geographic environment. The document is typically in the form of a map of the potential project area to identify any on-site and adjacent facilities and infrastructure that can be easily relocated and/or may constrain development, such as wharf areas, power substations, utility vaults, security buildings, rail infrastructure, and access roadways, tunnels, and bridges. The map should show neighboring properties, identify space that may be available for purchase. Other opportunities may include underutilized resources or switching land from one use to another, or major equipment such as ship-to-shore cranes, conveyors, gangways, and cargo storage area passenger processing equipment. On the constraint side, identify any nearby land use which may be perceived to restrict expansion opportunities in the opportunities and constraint document. This includes easements, power lines, or utilities such as storm weather outfalls that cannot be easily relocated. Neighboring uses such as military facilities, airfields, or power plants may come in their own specific set of restrictions which should be included. Additionally, some locals may have community concerns such as protected view corridors or public access points, which should be indicated in the document. To the extent possible, also identify sensitive environmental areas such as wetlands, floodplains, sensitive or protected fish and wildlife habitat, and take into consideration the unique needs associated with this type of areas. Regulatory review, revise, and refine the opportunities and constraint document over the course of the project definition process and use it as a common foundation on which all project alternatives are developed, judged, compared, and qualified. Alternatives, development, and analysis. The process of forming project alternatives is iterative, and with each round of alternatives development and analysis, new alternatives are proposed and improvements and new ideas are generated. Alternative creation. Start with the planning effort with multiple project alternatives in mind. Recognize that no change or not build is a project alternative and often considered as a base case. Pursuit of a single project alternative generally leads to internal linking and prevents the port owner from rationally addressing the viability of alternative development strategies and constrains planners from considering the interests of broadest range of port stakeholders. Be mindful of the provision of public benefits and impacts, safety, sustainability, environmental, etc., and community input when creating the alternatives. For those projects involving federal action, NEPA requires multiple alternatives with public engagement occurring prior to setting on a final alternative. Alternative assessment and review. Review and gauge each proposed project alternative in relation to the project context, goals, and objectives with each planning iteration. The focus of this effort includes examination, understanding at the highest level the physical and institutional elements of each alternative and how those elements relate to existing conditions and to elements in other alternatives. Winnowing, eliminating alternatives that do not sufficiently align with the project goals and objectives, such as providing inadequate capacity or having the potential to generate unacceptable impacts. Extending, identifying new alternatives that should be considered or alteration to proposed project alternatives that might provide a better balance of performance capabilities and impacts. At the end of this effort, the project team should have a select number of reasonable alternatives that can be refined and subjected to a higher level of scrutiny and assessment of feasibility. Refinement of reasonable alternatives. Refinement of reasonable alternatives should focus on identifying in logical discrete steps how the port would move from an existing condition to the final project within the project context. Phasing. A project plan should incorporate the ability to divide a project's development program into major discrete steps that can be implemented over time. The project may also include elements or phases that require work on infrastructure outside of the port's owner's control, such as nearby roadways or rail infrastructure, and these elements should be clearly identified. Prepare phasing documents to allow for port construction or acquisition of major assets with minimum disruption or existing operations or forecasted method. For a redevelopment project, phasing analysis is essential in understanding the financial and operational impacts of decommissioning equipment and/or portion of a port facility. It is likely that implementing a phase will temporarily reduce capacity or cause negative impacts. Prepare a construction or decommissioning phase that shows the port during that phase. The port owner should coordinate with its state Department of Transportation and MPO to determine whether any projects scheduled for construction might impact port access routes. Incorporate this information into the phasing documents such that any reduction in capacity as a result of port project may be aligned with the disruption period of the transportation project. Timing. The sequence and timing of phase improvements should be considered in relation to the market forecast of demand and the ability of funds for capital expenditure. A comparison of the phase timing of the project alternatives and the demand forecast will allow the port owner to understand the date ranges by which each phase will need to be completed to minimize impacts on market potential. Timing of development or acquisition phases will also be influenced by capital finance plan. When funding will be available will dictate when money can be spent on the project. Details. Examine at least at the conceptual level some of the critical details associated with each reasonable alternative It is not uncommon for infrastructure elements to influence the order in which a site is developed or reconfigured, so as to minimize the cost or eliminate redundant development. Cost. Generate order of magnitude construction cost, environmental mitigation cost, and equipment acquisition cost to correspond with the phasing documents for each reasonable project alternative. Quantities should be derived directly from the documents, and until costs should reflect historical data from similar projects as well as local cost factors and escalation, if a port owner plans to finance or fund the project using federal government. Detailed financial analysis of the project alternatives that enables the identification of recommended project is discussed in the feasibility module.